Hi everybody, I'm Ross Hill, Director of Intelligence for At-Risk Global Risk Intelligence Team, and welcome to our latest edition of our weekly Intelligence Insights. Today we will continue to cover the war in Ukraine, then we'll talk about cyber stalking, and finally an update on hate and anti-government groups in the United States. So first up, Russian forces are completing their withdrawal from the Kiev area. Ukrainian forces are continuing to clear some of the isolated troops that have actually been left behind in that retreat. This is a pretty significant victory for Ukraine, but it's probably not going to be decisive in the overall trajectory of the conflict, and that's because Russia is regrouping its forces in eastern and southern Ukraine. They've actually been able to make some progress there since the war began, although most are not expecting them to make any further significant progress, or not quickly anyway. And there's some question marks, whether they can actually take any more territory, or if they do, if they actually got the resources to then hold on to it. But actually, it's also unclear if Ukraine can continue to repeat its successes against the concentrated Russian forces in the east. So the outcome of the conflict, or the trajectory of the conflict, over the next 1 to 2 months, we'll get a really good idea of how that's going to go. And I think that time period looks quite critical. But as Ukraine has been taking back territory, we're seeing lots of evidence of war crimes committed by Russian troops, lots of killings of civilians, and that's prompted further calls for sanctions. Some of those may well come in this week. It's sort of unclear exactly what they might look like. May target Russia's coal and oil industry, but really not expecting it to target gas exports, given a lot of Europe's reliance on Russian gas. But it appears that the negotiations we've been having are not going so well. We've got Russia's chief negotiator saying that the talks hadn't actually progressed enough to lead towards a meeting between Zelensky and Putin. And really, we don't expect negotiations to go anywhere in particular until Putin engages. The main sticking points are security guarantees for Ukraine. If it does pledge neutrality, it wants some pretty significant guarantees against further Russian aggression. And then also the status of the territory in the east and the south that Russia currently occupies, and what will happen with that is going to be a particularly big concern. So all indicators at the moment continuing to point towards some kind of prolonged conflict. In terms of a ceasefire, we may see Russia sort of offer one, or maybe even some localized ones, based on humanitarian kind of efforts. But because Russia is in a weak position, seeing some reporting saying that if Russia does offer ceasefires, then it may actually just be a way of kind of trying to break Ukraine's momentum that they have at the moment. And so we need to be careful kind of if we see reports of a ceasefire coming in, how long term that might actually be. And then with the war in Ukraine, we need to keep an eye on the second and third order effects. And we have the World Trade Organization cutting its global trade forecast for 2022 by about half. The forecasts have been for 4.7% growth, but now it's around 2.5%. Also adding in some pandemic-related supply chain problems. But the Director General of the WTO was particularly worried about the increased costs of food, and stating that she believed that a food crisis was brewing. That's something that we've been reporting over the last few months, a significant risk of food riots in places that are heavily reliant on food imports. That's it for Ukraine. I'll now hand you over to Cooper McGill, who's going to talk to us about cyber stalking.
Hey, thanks, Ross. So a story last week where a man was arrested after he utilized his Apple Watch to stalk his ex-partner. And this is someone he's already been facing 2 domestic assault charges from some incidents last year. But essentially, he strapped his Apple Watch to the victim's tire spoke and was using it to follow her, had been sending her, threatening messages and demanding to know her location. And obviously she was, looking to get a protection order and was not willing to provide her location. So he strapped this watch to her tire and followed her around. And ultimately police did end up being called. And he admitted that the Apple Watch was his and he had been using it to follow her and was promptly arrested. And this kind of comes on the heels of some additional stories last year and in recent months regarding the Apple AirTags. Apple AirTags were in the news for a while as there had been reports of individuals saying that they had been used to stalk them, or they had been placed, on their vehicle in their wheel wells and used to follow those vehicles and then ultimately steal those vehicles. And, the Apple Watch incident really kind of is an indication of an increasing sort of industry issue and trend with these location sharing devices. Of course, I think an Apple Watch being used in this instance is probably less likely on a larger scale. You're talking about a piece of equipment that is, pretty expensive, all things considered. Whereas an AirTag, for example, is, about $30 and is definitely more accessible. But again, it's really about kind of an industry-wide issue as far as, a lot of very convenient tech and tools that are incredibly useful in our everyday lives, but can also create a pretty significant vulnerability. Additionally, last week there was an update that some researchers had been able to exploit the remote key function of a number of different Honda vehicle models in order to open the car, start the car themselves. And so again, while this isn't directly related to cyber stalking, it's, clear that as technology advances and things become more convenient, with that new technology, very often there can be some significant security concerns. So that's just something for us to continue to keep an eye on. These things are changing every day. New vulnerabilities are discovered and exploited every day. It's just a constantly evolving landscape. So we'll continue to watch things like this into the future. But that is what I've got for you today, and I will pass it over to Roman Fisher, who is going to talk about hate and anti-government groups.
Thanks, Cooper. Good morning, all. So in early March, the Southern Poverty Law Center released its annual report on hate and anti-government groups. The SPLC said it identified, which is down from 838 in 2020. Hate groups had risen to a high of 1,021 in 2018. The number of anti-government groups fell to 488 in 2021, down from 566 in 2020. Such groups peaked at 1,360 in 2012. The report suggests that extremist ideas that mobilize these groups now operate more openly in the political mainstream. And the decline in numbers of these groups does not represent a decline in power or influence. A perfect example of this is the SPLC reports that the number of active Proud Boy chapters has increased to 72 in 2021, which is up from 43 in 2020. The rise in chapters was significant considering that more than 36 members of the group have been charged in relation to their role in the Capitol, the Jan 6 Capitol attack. Some of the key points for security professionals to keep in mind here is polarizing political issues provide the fuel for hate in anti-government groups. And as these issues divide larger portions of the population, some extremist ideas have become more accepted in the mainstream. Current issues fueling these groups include critical race theory, books addressing LGBTQ identity in public schools, certainly continuing issues surrounding the coronavirus, vaccine and mandates, and lastly, immigration issues. Moving forward, emerging polarizing political and social issues will certainly sustain ideological bonds and motivations within these groups. In particular, it's especially important to keep an eye on issues that reach levels that may trigger protests. As we've seen, these groups are usually highly represented during right-leaning or far right-leaning protest activity. And lastly, current prosecutions and lawsuits are likely to stifle any increased mainstream acceptance of far right groups. The Attorney General, an example of this is the Attorney General of Washington, D.C. has expanded his lawsuit against members of the Jan 6 protesters that played leading roles in the attack on the Capitol. The DA claims that the suit is one of a handful of major efforts by those affected by Jan 6, the Jan 6 riot. And the suit seeks to claim damages from its most prominent participants. And I'll turn it back to Ross.
Thanks, Raymond. That's all we've got for you today. We hope you found the content useful, and we'll see you again next week.